7-year-old Tommy had always been told to stay away from apartment 13. His mother never gave him a reason, just that Mr. Grayson was not right. Mr. Grayson had lived there for as long as anyone could remember. Some of the older neighbors said he had been there for decades, though no one could recall exactly when he had moved in. He was an odd, silent man, always wearing a long, faded brown coat, even in the hottest summers. His clothes smelled musty, like old books and damp wood, as if they had never been washed. His shoes were worn and scuffed, yet he walked without making a sound. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice was no louder than a whisper, dry and cracked, as if he hadn't used it in years. No one knew where he went during the day. No one ever saw him leave his apartment. One night, Tommy was taking out the trash when he heard a voice whisper from the slightly open door of apartment 13. "Tommy, I see you." Mr. Grayson stood inside, his frail body hunched, arms dangling limply at his sides. His skin looked paler than before, almost gray, as if the color had been drained from him over time. His thin white hair clung to his scalp in wisps, and his cloudy eyes were wide with fear. But behind him, something moved. At first, Tommy thought it was just the shadows shifting with the dim light from the hallway. But then he noticed it was breathing. A shape unfolded from the blackness, its form tall, impossibly tall, stretching almost to the ceiling. It was thin, its long arms hanging far too low, fingers like twisted black roots curling toward the floor. And it was watching him. Then it smiled, a grin that stretched impossibly wide, revealing a row of jagged, uneven teeth, too sharp, too long. Mr. Grayson shuddered, but didn't move. He just stood there, his body locked in place, his hands trembling at his sides. It was only then that Tommy noticed the shadow's fingers were wrapped around his shoulders. "Help me, Tommy. It won't let me leave." The thing twitched, its fingers tightening around Mr. Grayson's shoulders. The man let out a soft gasp, like he had just been squeezed, his whole body shuddering violently. Tommy took a step back. The thing in the dark noticed. Its head snapped toward him, the motion sharp, unnatural, like a broken doll jerking upright. The lights in the hallway flickered, and in that split second of darkness, the thing moved. As Tommy turned to run, something caught his eye. A wall covered in old, faded photographs. They weren't just decorations. They covered the entire surface of the wall, as they were all of children, dozens of them. Their faces were frozen in time, some smiling, some staring blankly at the camera. The photos were old, yellowed and curling at the edges, as if they had been hanging there for years, maybe decades. But something was wrong. In every single one, a shadowy shape lurked in the background. At first, Tommy thought it was just the trick of light, but as he stepped closer, his stomach dropped. The same dark figure, the one standing behind Mr. Grayson, was in every photo. Sometimes it was just a faint smudge in a window. Other times it was a long-fingered hand resting on a child's shoulder. And in the oldest, most faded photograph, Tommy saw something that made his blood run cold. It was a picture of Mr. Grayson. He was young in the photo, no older than 10. And then, behind him, wrapped around him, just like now, was the shadow. It had been with him his entire life. Tommy clamped his hands over his mouth to keep from screaming. Something cracked behind him. Tommy wheeled around just in time to see the thing lurch toward him, its fingers stretching toward him, impossibly long, curling like skeletal hands reaching through the gloom. Tommy. The voice that came from it was wrong, a mix of whispers layered on top of each other, like a dozen different people speaking at once. Some voices pleaded, others laughed, but all of them spoke his name. His body screamed, "Run!" But before he could move, something cold brushed against his cheek. Tommy bolted. He didn't stop running until he slammed into his mother at the other end of the hall. "Tommy, what's wrong?" she asked, gripping his shoulders. "Mr. Grayson," he panted. Something's in there with him." His mother's face paled. She grabbed his wrists and pulled him back toward the apartment. "Tommy," she said, her voice shaking, "Mr. Grayson died last week." Tommy's stomach lurched. "No," he whispered. "I just saw him. He was in there." His mother shook her head. "Mr. Grayson has been gone for days, Tommy. No one lives in that apartment anymore." That night, Tommy lay in bed, unable to sleep. He couldn't stop thinking about the photographs, the children's faces. Had they all seen it too? Had they all vanished the way Mr. Grayson had? He squeezed his eyes shut. Maybe his mother was right. Maybe it was just a bad dream. Then the room grew cold. A slow creeping chill slid down his spine, wrapping around him like icy fingers. And then, from the darkness of his closet, he heard it again. A whisper. "Tommy, I see you." The closet door cracked open. This time, he wasn't fast enough to run.